Referendum Day, not too far away. It is compulsory on October 14 for all of us 18 and over to say either yes or no. The question, do you support a form of recognition for Indigenous Australians through the creation of a new constitutional entity to be called The Voice? The body would have the constitutional entitlement to be able to make representation to Parliament and executive government on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, when it was first proposed, it was popular, but as time has gone on and concerns have been raised, I think it's fair to say that support has slipped lower and lower. Polls show it's on track to be defeated. However, polls have been wrong before. We know that. And the Yes campaign is promising a strong finish. Over the past 12 months, we've spoken to both sides, yes and no. We've had Dean Parkin from the Yes camp. He's the Yes 23 campaign director. He's been in the studio several times. Jacinta Price from the No camp has been on. Anthony Albanese has told us why we should be saying yes. Warren Mundine has argued why we should say no. We've also chatted to Voice supporters who have raised concerns about the chances of success, people like Professor Greg Craven and Father Frank Brennan, both of whom, by the way, will be voting yes. Today we're joined by Noel Pearson. He is one of Australia's most influential Indigenous rights leaders and activists, and he's a key architect of the Voice proposal. He's with me in the studio. Welcome, Noel Pearson.
Hey, thank you very much, Ben. Great to be here.
I just said welcome, and I want to kick off with this. We're going to focus on the Voice, but
yes,
most of the time it's Indigenous people welcoming people like me. And I'm curious to know what your feelings are about the welcome to country and the acknowledgements that happen before functions and meetings and even football games. Do you believe that these things are sometimes overdone and that they lose some of the original meaning?
I think it's an important development, but we in Australia are still learning. We've got to adopt a sensible approach to rituals in our public life and in our private life in the community. I think it's a great development. New Zealand does similar things. Canada does similar rituals. But I think we're still in the learning phase here in Australia when it is appropriate to have a welcome to country and so on.
But when you have shopping dockets saying Coles Group acknowledges the traditional custodians, when you have Big W making announcements when you're buying things in the store, when you have Qantas planes giving an acknowledgement every time you land.
Yeah, those are new experiences for Australia, and we've got to be sensible about it. In the wake of this referendum, I think we ought to come to a consensus about the occasions upon which we use the welcome.
In the fair income department, you think they're used a little bit too much from time to time?
Well, when we have meetings and so on, it might be over the Zoom. There's acknowledgement of country and so on. Some people do, some people don't. People don't know what to do often. I think we've got to adopt a sensible approach to these things.
But what does that mean when you say sensible approach? No, you think sometimes it's overdone. Come on.
Yeah, well, when someone opens a meeting, that's fine. But then often I see people, every speaker then subsequently does their own welcome. And it cuts into the meeting, I can tell you.
Okay. Let's talk about the Voice. What do you say to no advocates who argue that the Voice contradicts the principle of equality of citizenship? Why should one group of Australians, because of their ancestry or the colour of their skin, have the constitutional right to be able to speak to Parliament and the government on all matters, which is a legal entitlement not given to the other 97% of Australians?
Okay, making representations, that's the words in the alteration that we're being asked to approve. Making representations is democracy 101. It is what anybody can do. Qantas has been making representations.
They don't have a constitutional entitlement to
Okay, so the question of treatment, equal treatment, goes back to 1901. 1901 was when special treatment hit the Constitution, and that special treatment was to exclude Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from participation in the democracy, from participation in the Constitution, from recognition within the Constitution.
So it's making up for that?
It's making up for the special treatment quotation marks. It really was special mistreatment, and we're now making up for that.
Okay, I heard you make a comment the other day. You spoke about the original Australians and the new Australians.
Yeah.
I'm keen to know what category I fall into.
Okay, we're talking about who was here prior to 26 January 1788.
I wasn't.
It was Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, we happen to have dark skin, but if we were in the north of Sweden or the north of Norway or the north of Russia, we would be Sami people who are blonde and blue-eyed, and we'd be indigenous. And, of course, all peoples around the earth are indigenous to somewhere. In Australia, we've now got an opportunity to acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, in the words of the amendment, the first peoples of Australia. Recognition as the first peoples of Australia.
Do you think people who are voting no or who are thinking about voting no are racist?
Oh, absolutely not. This is our most sacred document as Australians, the Constitution, which is why we're so conservative about changing it. And that is how it should be. We should be very careful in the decision we make about changing any word in the Constitution. So I'm completely understanding of the fact that we have to answer the real questions that Australians have about the changes. 92 words are going to change. We have to answer all of the concerns that Australians have about that.
The reason I asked you that question is you've been very passionate about this issue, and I acknowledge this goes to your core. You've been fighting your whole life for these causes, but some of your attacks have been extreme. You've accused Jacinta Price of punching down on blackfellas, being trapped in a redneck celebrity vortex. You've compared Peter Dutton to Judas and the Undertaker preparing the grave for Uluru. You've described the Indigenous leader Mick Gooder as a bedwetter. You targeted Julian Leeser and made references to his Jewish faith. You called readers of the Australian newspaper borderline casual racists. So, have you had your time again, Noel?
I'm not perfect, Ben, like everybody. I'm a debater in public life. I've got a cause to prosecute, and I make mistakes.
Do you apologise for them?
I've acknowledged them, absolutely. Absolutely.
And do you apologise to those people for those comments?
Absolutely. You know, where I've been human and gone too far in the debate, of course. My father would have expected no less from me. He would be as disappointed in me as anybody. But I have to say, the political challenge was to get the referendum through the Parliament. That was the stormy straits.
So you go in all guns blazing.
Oh, like everybody else, right?
Now, listen, I'm going to bring you to one of those examples, right?
Yep.
One of the memorable clashes you had about The Voice was way back in November of 2016. So I'll take you back there. You met with the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, the Labor leader Bill Shorten, and some other MPs in the Cabinet room. Malcolm wrote in his book, a general discussion followed and there wasn't a lot of support for The Voice. We weren't comfortable with the Constitution establishing a National Assembly open only to members of one race. Bill said the idea didn't have a snowball's hope in hell. Witnesses say that you exploded. You called Malcolm Turnbull a white C, the Indigenous Minister Ken Wyatt a black C, the Indigenous Labor Senator Pat Dodson an effing black C. Why were you so angry?
Oh, that's a complete misrepresentation. Firstly, it was Malcolm that said we had a snowflake's chance in hell, not Bill Shorten. Malcolm said it.
Bill's never denied saying it himself, I should just clarify. And Malcolm says in the book, I returned across the corridor to my office and Pearson followed me. He became angry, he stood very close. You wouldn't deny, I mean, there was some pretty strong language that day, wasn't there? You were angry.
Oh, absolutely. Not the language that he's saying, but I said to... Okay, I'll tell you what I said.
Don't say it exactly. We'll get pulled off air now.
No. I said, Malcolm, I'm going to fight you on this. That's what I said.
You can be quite intimidating when you need to be, can't you?
Oh, Pat Dodson was standing there. Ken Wyatt was standing there. And I made it clear to Malcolm that ruling out The Voice was not acceptable. We were just about to go out to conferences speaking with Australians about the concept. And that is what we did.
Noel Pearson is our guest in the studio. I'm keen to know how the idea of The Voice really came about? Because you've always said it was the outcome of the Referendum Council and 12 regional dialogues that culminated in the 2017 Uluru Statement. Yet even before the first of those dialogues got underway, you'd already determined that the answer would be the voice. You'd suggested a voice before the dialogues happened.
Well, actually, the expert panel, which was before the Referendum Council, appointed by Julia Gillard in 2011, had proposed a certain form of recognition. And that it was met with vehement opposition from constitutional conservatives like Professor Craven, Julian Leeser, and a whole lot of conservatives resisted the 2011 proposal. I caught a taxi over the Sydney Harbour Bridge to the Australian Catholic University in North Sydney, and I went into the Vice-Chancellery with Professor Craven, and Julian Leeser was there, Damien Freeman, another colleague, was there, and we had a discussion about what's the solution. If you guys are going to block the expert panel proposal, what's the solution? What came out of that was, well, instead of a constitutional right to challenge laws of Parliament, why don't you have a say over them?
All right, let me just go to the timeline, because the issue that I'm raising here, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, we're told that the idea came directly from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'm wondering whether it's more accurate to say that it came from you. In a September 2014 quarterly essay, you called for a mechanism guaranteeing the Indigenous voice, where a new body could be established to effect this purpose. That was September 2014. In July 2015, after a meeting with Tony Abbott, you put out a statement where you spoke about a new advisory body established under the Constitution. In November 2016 was that meeting with Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten and others. December 2016, the regional dialogue started, all led by you, and they were presented with 5 different models for recognition. And all of these dialogues that were led by you, they all happened to agree that the voice was the answer, the mode of recognition that you had been calling for 3 years. So when you say it came directly from Aboriginal people, isn't it also accurate to say it was Noel's idea?
No, all of those things, all of those events that you've recounted, which are correct, follow my meeting in North Sydney with constitutional conservatives.
Who came up with the voice?
That name came later.
Who?
But the function of an advisory committee was developed with Professor Craven and other constitutional conservatives, including Professor Anne Toomey from Sydney University. That was done in 2014, and a group of us wrote a letter to Tony Abbott when he was Prime Minister, including Professor Toomey, Professor Craven, and Professor Marcia Langton and myself. We wrote together.
Out of interest, it's a very powerful name, right? The whole country's been talking about it for the last year or more. Who came up with it?
I really cannot recall whose idea it was.
No one's claiming credit?
In the early stages, the name was DILAC, the working title, because DILAC is a Yolngu word from northeast Arnhem Land, meaning eminent group of leaders. And so DILAC was the kind of working title back in 2014. And after the Uluru Statement, it was very clear that the word voice, and I cannot claim...
It could have been you.
I cannot claim ownership for the branding.
But you're not sure it might have been you?
No, I would know if I was responsible for the word.
The most important thing is that Anthony Albanese then picked up the ball and ran with it. So take me to the moment that happened, because he took the words nearly verbatim from your submission in 2018 to a joint select committee. Your submission was one of 18 that were received.
Yep.
The committee in the final report concluded neither the principle nor the specific wording of provisions to be included in the Constitution are settled. More work needs to be undertaken. But the PM adopted your proposal nearly word for word. So take me to the moment when Anthony Albanese agreed. Was there a handshake moment?
The difference between the wording of our submission in prior to Labor gaining power is quite significant in relation to the current.
That's debatable. Maybe the current, but the one that he announced originally Are you also?
Well, no. The words "in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people" as the first peoples
let's
of
not
Australia.
argue over the words.
Yeah,
I take your point. They're different words. I take your point.
They're different.
Tell
words.
me about the moment that Anthony Albanese said, "Hey, Noel, I'm going to do this."
Well,
where were you? What happened?
I was watching the election night coverage, and the Prime Minister announced his commitment to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart and to move a referendum of the Australian people in this term. That's the first time I heard. Like every other Australian.
You found out on election night?
I found out on election night.
You must have lobbied him prior to the election.
Oh, along with everybody else.
So he didn't give you a commitment years earlier or months earlier to say, right, Noel, I'm going to do it?
Let me tell you about my relationship with Prime Ministers. I went through, what was it, 5 years of Scott Morrison? Mm-hmm. Never had one conversation.
Not one?
Not one.
You've been through a few PMs,
I've been through. So, and same with the current Prime Minister. Unless there's a specific reason to talk to the reigning power of the day, I'm not in the business.
You've had some very animated conversations with Prime Ministers as well. I had an MP say to me once, when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, Noel bullied the hell out of Tony. Now, I want to be clear. I put that to Tony Abbott at one stage and he said, oh, well, I don't know whether that's the appropriate word, but I said he was obviously pretty formidable to deal with.
Oh, I can tell you that, Tony and I were mates, right?
Were mates?
Were mates, yeah.
No longer?
We've given each other some character references since then.
What about Malcolm Turnbull, mates with Malcolm now?
I don't take this personally. These are prime ministers of the country that we've had to deal with over the years.
Bill Shorten doesn't talk to you anymore, does he?
No, I talk to Bill.
You do? You're talking again?
I'm just not one of these people that are constantly knocking on the doors of people in power.
All right.
My work is much lower down the food chain than that.
Oh, come on, Noel. 25 minutes after 7 o'clock, and we're having an extended conversation with Noel Pearson for obvious reasons. And thank you for coming in, by the way, and sparing the time to talk to us.
I'm glad to be here.
Let me talk about treaty. Did you think it was weird when the Prime Minister was backing away from his commitment for a treaty with First Nations people, because he's committed to the Uluru Statement in full? I know we're only voting on the voice at the end of the year, we got that, but it was a bit weird when he sat in the chair that you're in and he was saying, this has got nothing to do with treaty. You've been honest, Noel, about the fact that the first door you want to open is the voice in the Constitution, and the second door is the treaty door.
Well, the second door of treaty is already happening in Queensland on a bipartisan basis.
The PM says the same thing.
It's happening in Victoria, and all of these treaty processes are subject to the parliaments of the states.
What about a national
and
treaty?
Territories? That could be an agenda down the track, but what we're voting on here is a voice. Any treaty would require the consent of Parliament.
But you need the voice in order to get the treaty. You've made that point. You've got to open the voice door first in order to get to the second door, which is the treaty door.
Well, that's a political point about what's achievable. Okay. What's achievable now is the voice. And because that's been the agenda, right? Ever since John Howard committed to constitutional recognition, it is an advisory body in the Constitution that has been the agenda.
When do you see, and look, this is a hypothetical, just say the voice gets up in 36 days from now, when do you see the treaty discussion starting?
I don't think we have to set up the voice first. The details of the legislation will need to be worked through. I don't think this term of Parliament will see the legislative structure up. Maybe not. But a lot of work has got to be done on the detail of the voice, because under the provision, it is the Parliament that has the responsibility to define the voice.
Well, let's go to the structure of the voice and some of these, basic kind of questions. How many members will there be on the voice?
Parliament will determine that.
Okay. Do you know if they'll be elected or selected?
Parliament will determine that.
Will Indigenous people get a chance to vote on who sits on the voice?
You know, as I say, Parliament's going to determine all of the details. That's the last clause of the actual provision.
Okay.
It gives to the Parliament, like it always does.
All
That's
right, but
how
just
our
on
Constitution works.
On that, Clause 3 of the proposed constitutional change says, Parliament shall have the power to make laws with respect to the voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures.
Correct.
But no legislation can limit the High Court's capacity to ensure the voice can exercise its constitutional functions of making representations to ministers and public servants. Correct?
Yes, and make representations.
The
and
High Court has the final say.
Oh, yes, the High Court has the final say over the entire Constitution. And I can tell you, in the history of our 120 years of our Constitution, people have attempted to take actions in the High Court, probably in respect of every provision. Somebody tries it out. But they're not going to get very far in relation to this drafting, because this drafting is very safe. It's been looked over by former High Court judges. It is as inert as it comes.
Okay.
You know
that there are some former High Court judges like Ian Callanune who warned of a decade or more of constitutional and administrative law litigation. The constitutional law expert Greg Craven, who's voting yes, by the way, warned that the High Court challenges are a certainty. There's no doubt that Indigenous people will use the High Court to do this. So there are a few legal experts, and I acknowledge there are plenty of legal experts who agree with what you're saying, but there are others who've got concerns.
Law and legal challenges are all about, is there an angle that we can try out? And many of those attempts result in the court saying, sorry, guys, you're trying to attack this provision with that argument, but that's not sustainable.
Which way do you think it's going to go?
I think we're going to get there. As long as we listen to the Australian people over the coming 5 weeks, to the questions that are still outstanding, that they have in their minds, as long as we engage with those questions respectfully and carefully, and we supply the answers to those questions, I think we're going to get there.
All right. With that in mind, when you say as long as we can answer those questions that people have, I just asked you a number of questions about how many people are going to be on it. Are they elected or selected? And you've said, well, the Parliament will decide. I've got a few people here saying the same thing. Well, so hang on a moment, we vote for it and then we find out afterwards how it's all going to work.
That is the case with everything under the Constitution. The Constitution says the Parliament shall make laws about taxation, but the 4,000 pages of taxation legislation, we can't put that in the Constitution. Not only that, you want the Parliament to be able to change the legislation over time, to make it better and to address problems that were not foreseen in the past. That is the same thing with the voice.
Okay, but let me pick up the tax example. Would the voice want to be briefed on taxation policy?
Oh, okay, so taxation specifically affects the treatment of mining income that communities get, landowners get. Specifically applies to Indigenous people in relation to their mining income. And so if there were changes to the taxation treatment of income to Indigenous communities, we would want to say about that.
All right. But when you say we vote on something and then we work out the detail later,
yes,
that's not what people are used to when they're going to an election, though. When we have an election, we focus our minds and say, what's this person saying? What's that person saying? They're grilled. They're asked to answer questions in interviews and press conferences.
Yes.
So can you understand that this is a bit of an adjustment for people to make when they're used to getting these answers before we go to a poll?
And the previous government under Scott Morrison set up a 2.5-year process, which is the subject of a report by Professor Calmer and Professor Langton. That is work, a lot of hard work over 2.5 years, generating the possible detail that Parliament could consider.
No, I know, but if a politician said that leading up to an election, well, it's possible, maybe.
No, that's always the case, Ben. You go to the election with a policy. In this case, we are going with the clear words that authorise the Parliament to take full responsibility of everything.
If you were going to an election and you said, I'm going to set up a new body after being elected, and if the journalist said, well, how many people are going to sit on that body, and are they going to be elected or selected, the politician has to answer that question.
Oh, and the politician would only give a provisional answer.
Do you think they should be selected or elected?
That depends. Some of the traditional communities in Australia, like in Arnhem Land, they actually want to appoint according to their traditional process. Whereas in other areas, they will want to have a vote.
This is a big question for Indigenous people, right?
Absolutely.
They want to know because they're thinking, all right, well, I could be on The Voice or maybe I'll be left out of The Voice. We want to know. What's the process? How do you get on?
When this provision is put into the Constitution, I am sure that there will be a very rigorous process that takes into account the needs of traditional communities in Northern Australia, Central Desert and so on, but also accommodates Indigenous communities that are living in rural and regional areas and in urban areas.
Are we going to need to establish a set of protocols for making a recommendation, or can any member of The Voice, and you're probably going to say...
No, the legislation will prescribe exactly what form recommendations are made, who and what recommendations are actually formal advice through the process.
And then what happens if The Voice disagrees on something? If there's disagreement on The Voice body on a particular issue, will it be majority rules?
Well, my organisation, Cape York Institute, has specifically proposed that we operate a bit like parliamentary committees in that we allow dissenting reports. We allow those communities that dissent from the majority opinion, say alcohol management. I will never agree to advice to the federal parliament to weaken our alcohol management laws, right? That's a Cape York view. We believe alcohol management is very... Welfare reform. We believe very strongly in family responsibilities, welfare reform, and alcohol control. Now, we need to have the ability... If we can't convince everybody else to adopt the same policy as us, then we need to have the right to present our views as a dissenting view to the Parliament. And the Parliament kind of weighs. They're getting advice that says, change the alcohol regime.
Do we listen to this person or that person? And there's also a chance here as well, apart from disagreements within the Voice body, isn't there a strong chance that there are going to be more disagreements between Indigenous Australians and government? For example, if Peter Dutton was to become the Prime Minister, then all of a sudden, this is the bloke who didn't want us to have the voice. Won't it be the same as we see with things like the union movement, where all of a sudden it's warfare between the voice and the government of the day?
We live in a democracy, Ben. When you operate in a democracy, you have to take the power of the day. That is why I always dealt with John Howard. I always dealt with Tony Abbott. I dealt with Kevin Rudd. I dealt with Paul Keating. You have got to take the power of the day. You'd be a dill if you ignored the government of the day. And that's a necessary part. Everybody has to do that. You might prefer your political party to be in office, but that's not the way democracy works.
The time is 7:45. Noel Pearson is our guest. We'll talk to him up until 8 o'clock. It's probably one of the longest conversations I've had on the show,
Thank
Noel,
you, Ben. I'm really,
no, that's okay.
Really
that's
glad to be here.
Professor Megan Davis, one of the key voice architects, said on the 1st of April last year, the voice will be able to speak to all parts of the government, including cabinet ministers, public servants, and independent statutory officers and agencies such as the Reserve Bank. On the 19th of July, I asked the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, if the voice would be able to make representations to the Reserve Bank, and he said no. So, who's right?
The Prime Minister's right.
Megan's wrong?
Megan's wrong on that point, because the provision actually says this: make representations on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
Interest rates don't apply to Aboriginal people?
They apply to everybody, right? Defence applies to everybody. Taxation, mostly, only in relation to income that's specific to Indigenous communities. All of those matters are not like
No, that's right. You've answered that. Answered that.
For sure.
And look, this is just a quick one, but advising on the date of Australia Day or the flag or the national anthem.
Those debates will continue, and Indigenous people will have a view. You know what my view is? We're going to keep 26 January. I'd like 25 January to be a day where we recognise the Australia before the coming of the British. I think 24, 25 January are dates that we should recognise Australia before and Australia after. But that's my view, right? That's just one view from someone like me.
Can I just ask about all of the government agencies, the Indigenous agencies that are working on the ground already and with government? We spend billions of dollars a year through organisations like the National Indigenous Australians Agency, the Coalition of the Peaks, made up of more than 80 Aboriginal community-controlled peak organisations and members, the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, representing 145 Aboriginal and community-controlled health organisations. That sounds like Indigenous Australians already have a voice per se, because they're already advising about these important issues impacting Indigenous people.
Yes, they try to make representations and some of them succeed. Too many of them don't.
But the voice isn't going to succeed all the time either.
Oh, it'll succeed at a greater height. The fact that we have a constitutional voice, an official voice.
So it's a more powerful voice.
It's going to be hopefully listened to.
And that's when the Prime Minister said at one stage you'd be a very brave Prime Minister to say no to the voice.
Well, we need the government of the day to retain its control over policy and legislation, which we elect them to do. But of course, we want the government of the day to listen carefully to the advice. I think we'll get better policies. We'll get better outcomes when this advisory committee, and that's what it is. The voice is the brand name, but the reality of this body is that it is an advisory committee made up of Indigenous Australians from around the country, established to provide advice to the politicians in Canberra.
So what agencies are we going to take away or downgrade? If the voice is going to do the job that these other agencies are currently doing but not as powerful as the voice, you would acknowledge, and I know you have, Noel, that there have been billions of dollars spent in this space, a lot of it going towards improving outcomes. But how big is the wastage?
What proportion of productivity we get from that investment? I would say less than a quarter. Less than a quarter.
So billions of dollars are being wasted?
The productivity is very low in Indigenous affairs. Otherwise, we'd see it you can see it in the outcomes. You can see it in the health, education, justice.
Where's the money gone?
And, well, the important thing is it's got to be more productive. If you don't put the money into the things that are needed, that will empower Indigenous families, that's where the action has to happen.
A lot of people working in these agencies now find this argument really offensive because they feel like, hang on a moment, I mean, this is what we're doing now. I mentioned the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation. Their mission statement is, we work for and we are accountable to the communities and share a belief Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should have a meaningful say on policies and programs that impact them through formal partnerships with all levels of Australian governments. So they feel like, hang on a moment, we're doing this already and the voice is going to trespass on our turf.
Well, there are many good efforts taking place, but the overall productivity measure is very low with the voice because we need better policies. We actually need better solutions. And some of those solutions nobody has thought of. We're tackling poverty here. Nobody around the world really gets tackling poverty right. And these are issues that are going to require new, innovative, out-of-the-box solutions.
And you acknowledge that a lot of the money that's been spent has been wasted.
Oh, absolutely. That's why we're doing the voice. We want to stop the waste. We want to have more productive outcomes. We want to say, that program over there, it is useless.
Which one's useless?
Oh, mate, You got half the morning to talk about useless programs?
Yeah.
Because there's many of them.
For example?
Well, in some communities I've been to, you got 3 programs addressing a single issue. Why 3? It's because it's all these service providers. In a community in Cape York Peninsula of 1,300 people, 400 people come from the outside every day delivering programs, and I can't see what return we're getting from that.
So you want to add another layer of bureaucracy to
not
cut down
come
on that
Ben.
bureaucracy?
This is not a bureaucracy. This is a voice.
Okay, but
it has no role in delivering services. It doesn't administer a budget.
Okay, well let me
reframe
that. Let me reframe that. You want to add another group of advisors to take away from some of the money that's being spent on programs that aren't needed.
You know, the current scene is the product of no advice.
All right, but you've got access. You've just detailed how you've got access to all of these leaders.
Yeah.
Surely you would have said to them, I'm guessing, I don't know, hey, listen, this is a waste of money. You're pouring billions of dollars down the drain here. Axe that program. Get rid of it.
Absolutely, and that's what I try to do as an individual leader for my people in Cape York Peninsula.
And what? No one's listened to you?
We've got many important gains, and other leaders are kind of individually improving things in health, education, enterprise, employment, and so on. There's so many good things that happen. The problem is the overall picture is not good, because we don't have a systematic way of working with the government and working with the executive government. You know, put the parliament to one side. The important thing is Sir Humphrey is blocking us.
All right, you mentioned executive government. You want the voice to have the ability to advise the parliament and the executive government. The executive government could include cabinet, departments, public servants. You're encouraged to lose the words executive government or change the words to ministers of the Crown. So that would make it really clear that it's not up to every public servant or department to consult the voice. The Attorney-General, Mark Dreyfus, went into the referendum working group and tried to encourage you, Noel Pearson, and others, let's drop the words executive government. You wouldn't play ball.
No, that's not true.
Oh, he put forward a very convincing argument.
That's not true, Ben.
What did he say?
What was adopted just before the legislation was introduced was an amendment to the last clause, which made it clear that the Parliament has complete jurisdiction over that advisory function.
Are you denying that when the Attorney-General went into that room that he didn't suggest that it would be a greater chance of success without the words executive government?
You know, there was a lot of toing and froing
because
about this.
I know from someone who was in that room, Noel,
what I did
that he made it clear that this would be a greater chance of success if those words disappeared.